Hello, everyone. I think we're going to start. Online people, if you can hear us, just say something in the chat so that we know you can hear us. Thanks for coming, those online and offline. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Hubert. Hubert Au is a DPhil or PhD researcher in social data science at the University of Oxford. He's applying computational methods such as natural language processing and network analysis to answer sociological questions about things like the Me Too movement and other cultural questions, often things also touching on fact-checking and misinformation. And he has also worked for an IDSAI research project looking at semantic change in the language used in parliamentary debates. This is a project that started when I had just joined, but John here helped as well in the beginning. Jacqueline, who's not present, helped in part of it. And we're just really happy to kind of see the projects coming to an end. And Hubert's going to talk about that. I'm not going to spoil much of the talk, but I wanted to say thank you all for also coming to the IDSAI Research Seminar Series. We are coming back next week as well with another seminar, and I'll mention more about that in the end of the talk. But yeah, Hubert, thanks over and looking forward to it.
Great. Much, Chico, for the inviting me here today. Thank you. So as Chico mentioned, I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about this project that we kind of a little bit on semantic change and specifically how we can bring social. So we're kind of interested in semantic change. So how do words kind of change in time? How do they gain new meaning? And if we think back to the what I had on the previous slide, leave and pain, if I asked you about that now, you might quite reasonably think about Brexit. But maybe that wouldn't have been the case. So that's what we're kind of interested in. And in particular, we're kind of hypothesizing that different social or political groups, people with different affiliations should, like that they might take up different meanings of words, shift in their way of how their words in different ways. And so that's what we wanted to do. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, this was a project by Barbara McDelivery at KCL and Turing, and following up from the excellent work of Jacqueline. Just submitted this for ICWSM. Very kind of quick few background notes. It's kind of an active research area on lexical semantic change, or LSC, sometimes it's shortened to, and some recent papers people have produced kind of manually annotated diachronic corpus data. Diachronic just meaning across time. Focusing very specifically on this kind of time change effect. Some have proposed kind of specific evaluation frameworks for this, so looking at how words maybe retain identity or gain a new meaning, like polysemy, I think. And what when this kind of project was conceived of was the point that might have been missing was this kind of social aspect to it. So that's what we wanted to. And so that leads to this kind of overarching research question of how can so incorporate it. So to answer that, we drew from parliamentary data and drawing from this kind of existing data set of the Pulse Speech 2 data set, which had debate data for about 9 countries, ranging all the way back from 1987 to 2019. So notably, that means no COVID, and that will be relevant shortly. But we're interested in this kind of information because it's kind of very well documented, first of all, and there's full of social network information, party affiliations, debates that people share, constituencies that they're from, lots of different kind of where our methods kind of start is to think about, well, what words might we be interested in, and what events do we expect words to change meaning around. So we had the Brexit example earlier, and you'll notice here that these are all about September 11th, 2001. And we kind of went back and forth about thinking, well, what events could we choose, and which events would be significant enough that we could try and see change before and after in some way. And we're doing this kind of before and after thing and with the 9 countries, and kind of soliciting a bunch of colleagues and friends and saying, well, what would be interesting to you? We got a lot of interesting kind of ideas. I think in Austria, back to 1987, crisis in Germany, maybe earthquakes in New Zealand, but we couldn't find something that can span all 9 countries comfortably. And so in the end, we decided this was one that we could expect would be mentioned at least in all the parliaments to some degree, which is also why COVID would have been a great example, of course, but we didn't have the capacity to go out and collect all of that. So here what we have is a sample of the list. It's not the whole list of words that we'd expect to not change on the right, and words we'd expect to. So in the full list, we had about maybe 40 or 50 on the change side, and about a similar number of 40 to 50 to change. And setting it up like this allowed us to kind of focus on these words throughout the analysis, but it also, as I'll discuss shortly as well, we wanted to kind of figure out, could we make some sort of regression at the end, or kind of simple model, figure out, given these words, can we detect a kind of systematic change between the two? So with that in mind, our kind of first tool in the machinery was to get word embeddings. And I suspect many people in the room are quite familiar with them, but just for the benefit of anybody who isn't, word embeddings are basically numerical vector representations of words. And these are very, very common in natural language processing. And the way we create them is by giving what we call a corpus, or a body of text, to a machine learning algorithm. And depending on the context and the words it shares sentences with, we can get these numerical vectors, which are a very high dimension, and usually, so typically about 300 dimensions. And this image you see is an illustration of what they might look like. So the vector for cat and dog as domestic animals are typically a little bit bigger than they might be visually, at least. And so that's how it all starts. And since we're going to be training a bunch of these, we're going to be getting word embeddings, and we want to do it, say, before a time, so before September 11th, for example, and after September 11th, we can train these word embeddings separately. But the thing is, there's no guarantee that they will align, or there is no guarantee in the context of the previous image that the kind of axes in which the vectors are living on should be the same. So you might have cats and dogs vectors similar, car vectors separate, but in the 2 different bodies you feed to the same algorithm, and the differences between those texts might mean that those things might still be true, but the axes are simply rotated. So sort of in the style of this kind of red and blue leaf. I'm not actually sure what that is. You can see there's a line in the top left, but after some kind of matrix multiplication, basically some clever linear algebra, we can get it so that they overlap more reasonably. And you can think of this sort of as rotating the axes appropriately. And so this just means that we can make meaningful comparisons between sets of word embeddings that have the same word space before and after a certain time. It's also important to note that this doesn't mean that the words, the vectors for cat and dog, for example, are exactly aligned between 2 different sets of word embeddings. It just means the overall alignment optimized to a specific vectors are specifically aligned, but overall everything will be closer. And so this allows us to kind of conceptualize different classes of models, which we then generated. So the kind of first kind of baseline model we tried was we called the whole parliament model, and this was just a big mishmash. So everything before September 11th, we put into word embeddings, and then so we put in one embedding for all the words we're interested in, like terrorism, etc. After, and then we could compare them after the appropriate amount. Then moving on kind of more naturally also to the parliament model, and exactly what it suggests is that each speaker in parliament, each member of parliament will have their own kind of set of word embeddings. So their text and their speeches throughout debates be fed into word embeddings. And here it's also important to mention that there's definitely parameters to consider here of how far back before and after a specific time point you want to go. So even after we pinpointed the event of September 11th, we don't want to go all the way back to 1987. We want to go all the way forward to 2019. So settle in the end on 3 years back and forth to see that, okay, there'll be enough time for enough time beforehand to kind of generate a baseline, enough time afterwards for relevant reactions and bills to be passed, etc., debates to be had. So that's kind of set up. And then the retrofit class of models is sort of where the social network information can come in. Okay, on top of the speaker models that we have, the individual sets of word embeddings, we might want to say, okay, well, these two speakers belong to the same party, or they spoke a lot in the same debates. And that's the kind of thing we wanted to try to incorporate. And the way that worked was also sort of similar alignment process, but by defining specific sets of what we would give as synonyms to the training process. So we would say, okay, of these words of interest, anybody in the same party before 2001, we will assume that they are similar, and so we should align them. And so that was another specific process on top of the kind of overall alignment described earlier. And then from there, we can kind of make subsequent. That's the kind of three broad directions we had. And then from there, we can then actually try and measure some of that lexical change. And so there are two major ways we try to do this. One of them being cosine similarity. And again, these familiar concept to anybody who's worked. But if you think back to the vectors of the cats and dogs, the kind of angle between them is a little bit smaller, and that's sort of what the cosine similarity measures, is if they're closer, then the angle would be smaller. But we can also ask, what are the nearest neighbors around these words? So the word lion might be close to the word tiger, for example. And so we can measure before and after a time, what words are around this word. So tell me your company and I'll tell you who you are. So this gave rise to, and last thing, we wanted to take all of these measures and see if could a regression figure out. So we put in the cosine similarity or the nearest neighbors, and we also included the frequencies of the words that appeared. And this has been found to be quite influential in the kind of cosine words, as if a word appears a lot, kind of the signals in there about different meanings or multiple meanings can be often averaged out or kind of mushed because it's been used a lot by different people. And this has just been something found. But there were kind of a couple questions around how we should actually kind of cosine similarity. So in the speaker models, if we're trying to compare before and after, we have a lot of these individual word vectors for speakers, but we're trying to kind of combine them into, before or after did the word terror change. And so we're going to have to somehow average these vectors for all the speakers. And so the most straightforward way is just to take a mean. But another thing we tried, which we call the speaker plus set of models, was not to do that, as we thought that would also kind of mush out some of the variance, but to take the individual cosine similarities before and after the times for the speakers, and then take a mean and variance of that to see if that would give a better result. And we also tried doing total frequency or frequency ratios before and after a time. So in the end, lots of different models for countries, different model types, similarity types, and mechanical regression. So I'll just walk through a bunch of graphs, kind of showing some of these results now. and kind of talk through what we kind of. So the vertical axis here, the kind of logistic regression type, we don't need to go into all the detail of what these mean, but basically -1 to 3 are various combinations of the cosine similarity and frequency. And we can see that on the and the speaker plus is the ones with different kinds of comparison before and after a time, and then mean and variancing them. We can see overall the whole models do a little bit worse, and these are all accuracy scores. So the speaker models do a little bit better, and the retrofit models, but these are all again quite averaged. But just to kind of get a holistic picture of are improving a little bit on the baseline. Then looking across countries with a speaker model, we can see that we typically did a lot better on the English-speaking countries, so New Zealand and the UK. And I think this also highlights the importance of choosing the words. So what we did was we wrote all of these words in English, and we tried to kind of review these, but then edited them into other languages. And sometimes this can, of course, lose relevance in a different language. So I think that's definitely one point going forward I'd like to highlight as well. And models, we sort of see a similar pattern, like the English-speaking countries doing well, and sometimes a little bit better accuracy, but broadly similar results. So with the retrofit ones, I think these are interesting to note. A lot of them are empty because the way that the alignment process works was that with the synonyms that we were saying, we could specify, that meant that unlike the kind of overall alignment, this only worked if two different models that you're trying to align on synonyms do indeed have the same word. And it just turned out with some of the words that we were using, not a lot of MPs would use them consistently. Before and after, or if we're choosing a number of words, not all of them would have used all of them. So we kind of lose some vocabulary along the way, which is a sort of another methodological note forward, but we can see can do well. But I think just looking at the accuracy definitely was can be misleading. And if we look at F1 scores, we can see and look at actual data and the regression that goes into this. Often, because these vectors are so aligned, almost maybe over-aligned, the variance was sometimes lost in adding, party, debate kind of alignment. And only some of these models would work with a retrofit. So where do we go from here? We kind of thought, well, maybe the regression exercise is not so useful in the end. That's one of the main kind of learnings of this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the kind of retrofitting is meaningless. So we thought, okay, well, what if we went and looked at individual words and tried to look at how this alignment, or like at least color coding the after all the retrofitting processes for individual words, and see, can we visually see that there should be some interesting things to pick out here? And I think there are some interesting examples in the data set that we have. So what you see here is a kind of dimensionality reduced representation of the aligned vectors from on the word extremism. So dimensionality reduction, for anybody who's not familiar, this means we're taking these 300 dimension or 10-dimension word embeddings and kind of squishing them into a two-dimensional representation such that vectors that are far from each other remain far from each other in the two-dimensional space, vectors that are close. And so we can sort of color the circular dots are the ones after 2001, the crosses are before, and it's also colored by party. And we can qualitatively see that certainly averaging these by, or taking a mean average of the circular conservative dots, we can see could very close to a mean circular dots. So potentially a point against trying to do that averaging regression thing that we were doing, but could highlight interesting differences with a different approach. We're looking at the one from Austria, where answer or response, which was on the list of words we would expect to change. And we can see, I think clearly there are some party differences, at least between O and the blue, certainly red. And that would be, again, maybe something that would be lost by a kind of mean average. Help or aid again. And we can after as well. Fundamentalism in Denmark, definitely a lot more usage after the right time, although fewer examples from before maybe. So that kind of brings us to the end of what we did and found. And so I think although some of the regression results typically didn't provide a kind of consistent, promising improvement, some of them did. I think this kind of direction can be promising and hopefully can open up lots of future work in different applications. So I think we've also seen that the word choice can be very important, and this can be hopefully useful for work in the humanities or tracking specific word usage that there might be good other sides changes. But I think there also opens up a lot of potential future avenues of work. So potentially using different embedding methods. I mentioned a little bit about the kind of events in different countries, and I think that kind of specific contextual knowledge can make a big difference. Other sources, and then one of the benefits of this kind of the retrofitting, the alignment, was that it wasn't specific to the parties or the debates. You could insert other relevant pieces of social networking. So, and that again can just depend on the context of the interest there and the relevant information. And it may be that in the specific cases that we did it, there were pieces of social network information that could have included, or were maybe included too many, that kind of blurred some of the regression results. Covered a little bit of this, kind of concluding thoughts. And just the kind of stuff. Thank you all for listening. That brings me to the end. I'm happy to take any questions or